The Supreme Court chamber fell into a hushed silence as Justice Amy Coney Barrett addressed Elon Musk directly to her. Tone decidedly skeptical of the oral arguments in Federal Communications Commission via SpaceX had taken an unexpected personal turn as the Supreme Court justice questioned the billionaire's understanding of rural America's needs. "Mr. Musk," Justice Barrett said, glancing down at her notes, "you've repeatedly claimed your satellite internet service primarily benefits rural communities, yet your background suggests limited personal experience with rural America's challenges. How can someone who has spent their life in urban tech hubs truly comprehend the telecommunications needs of farmers in Iowa or ranchers in Montana?" The pointed question challenging both SK's credibility and the central argument of his case caused several other justices to look up with interest at the case before the Supreme Court involving a challenge to FCC regulations that would severely restrict its Starlink satellite internet service, a case with profound implications for millions of Americans living in remote areas with limited connectivity options. Musk stood motionless at the podium for a moment. His expression was unreadable. Rather than responding with a corporate defense, many expected he'd see his prepared notes. Aside from that, what followed was a deeply personal response that transformed the atmosphere of the nation's highest court and left Justice Barrett visibly emotional, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as the tech entrepreneur revealed a side of himself the public had never witnessed before. Before exploring this extraordinary Supreme Court confrontation that may reshape America's approach to rural connectivity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of pivotal moments in technology, law, and policy justice. Amy Coney Barrett had built her reputation as one of the Supreme Court's most meticulous questioners since her controversial confirmation in 2020. Known for her sharp legal mind and attention to detail, Barrett frequently challenged assumptions underlying arguments presented before the court. With her background as a law professor and federal appellate judge, she had established herself as someone who thoroughly examined the factual foundations of legal positions, particularly in cases involving technical matters. The case Federal Communications Commission versus SpaceX represented a critical juncture for rural telecommunications in America. An issue was whether the FCC could implement new regulatory requirements that would effectively force SpaceX to shut down 40% of its Starlink, dramatically reducing coverage in America's most remote areas. The FCC arguing these regulations were necessary to reduce orbital congestion. SpaceX maintained they were arbitrary, capricious, and would disproportionately harm rural Americans, for Elon Musk's stakes extended far beyond corporate profits. Starlink had become his most socially impactful venture, bringing high-speed internet to regions where terrestrial infrastructure remained economically unfeasible. Prior to the Supreme Court hearing, Musk had emphasized this mission repeatedly. "This isn't about market share or quarterly results. This is about whether millions of Americans will continue having access to the digital economy, educational resources, and telemedicine that many of us take for granted." The case had drawn extraordinary public attention. Rural advocacy groups filed amicus briefs supporting SpaceX. Telecommunications incumbents backed the FCC. Congressional representatives from rural states wrote public letters urging the court to consider the human impact of their decision, and medical associations documented how Starlink had enabled remote health care services in previously underserved communities. Justice Barrett's questioning reflected a fundamental skepticism shared by several justices and FCC commissioners. Could a billionaire technologist truly understand and prioritize rural needs? This skepticism had been reinforced by media narratives portraying Musk as disconnected from everyday American experiences, focused instead on ambitious projects like Mars colonization. What neither Justice Barrett nor the public knew was that Musk's commitment to rural connectivity stemmed from personal experiences never shared publicly, experiences that had shaped his understanding of digital isolation long before he became a household name. Musk prepared to respond to Tutt's challenge. He made a split-second decision to abandon his carefully crafted legal talking points and address the justice's question from a place of personal truth that would dramatically change the tenor of the proceedings. Justice Barrett Muskin, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I appreciate your question about my understanding of rural challenges." He paused, visibly considering how to proceed. The courtroom remained silent. the customary shuffling of papers, and whispered consultations among suspended, contrary to public perception. I wasn't always the person you see today. Musk continued before founding my companies before moving to California. I spent my formative years in very different circumstances. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward. Slightly, her interest is evident, Chief. Justice Roberts, who typically maintained an impassive demeanor during arguments, also appeared attentive to this unexpected development. When I first came to North America as a teenager, I worked on my cousin's farm in Saskatchewan, Canada, Musk explained, not as their son, not as a visitor, but as labor. Spent months living in a province where towns could be 50 miles apart, where the internet wasn't merely slow, it didn't exist for many residents. Justice Barrett's expression shifted slightly, her earlier skepticism giving way to careful assessment of Musk's response later. When attending college in Pennsylvania, I worked summers in rural areas of the state, including at a lumber mill in a town so remote that residents drove 2 hours to reach basic services. Most Americans have access within minutes. Musk reached for a glass of water. The first sign of emotion beginning to show in his typically composed demeanor as he continued, his voice took on a quality rarely heard in his public appearances, a rawness, that vulnerability. What's not? In my official biography of Justice Barrett is that after selling my first software company, I didn't immediately start Tesla or SpaceX. Spent 6 months living in a rural community in Colorado using an all-up connection, frequently experiencing firsthand the isolation that comes when digital connectivity is unreliable or absent. The justices exchanged glances, clearly not expecting in this personal testimony. Musk's own legal team appeared equally, suggesting this was not part of their prepared strategy, but my understanding of rural connectivity challenges is autobiographical. Musk continued his composure, returning. He reached into his suit jacket and removed several folded papers, with the court's permission. I'd like to share something not included in our briefs, the Chief Justice nodded. Making an exception to standard protocol given the unusual nature of the proceedings, these are letters, just a small selection from thousands received from rural Americans whose lives have been transformed by internet access. Musk unfolded the first page. This is from Sarah Johansson, a third-generation farmer in North Dakota who wrote, "Before Starlink, my children could participate in remote learning. During winter storms now my daughter is taking advanced courses not offered in our small school district." He turned to another letter from Dr. James Wilson of Kentucky, "and I can now provide telemedicine consultations to patients who previously had to drive 3 hours each way to see a specialist for elderly patients. Isn't convenience the difference between receiving care or going without?" As Musk continued reading excerpts, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. These weren't corporate talking points or abstract legal arguments. They were authentic human experiences that illustrated the real-world impact of the case before the court. Justice Barrett, who had begun the exchange with skepticism, was now listening intently. Her earlier challenge gave way to genuine engagement with the human dimensions of the regulatory dispute. When Musk reached the final letter from a veteran in rural Wyoming who described how connectivity had allowed him to receive mental health services while being physically isolated, Barrett's expression showed emotion. Then came the moment that would be described in headlines across the country. Musk looked directly at Justice Barrett, departed from legal convention entirely. "Justice Barrett, you asked whether I truly comprehend rural telecommunications needs. The truth is no. A single person fully can, but what I do understand through both personal experience and the thousands of stories shared with our team is the profound human cost of digital isolation, and with respect, that's something the FCC's technical arguments about orbital parameters completely fail to address." Justice Barrett's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion as Musk concluded his response to the normally composed justice. She reached for a tissue, briefly dabbing at the corner of her eye, a profoundly human moment rarely witnessed in the formal setting of the Supreme Court. The chamber remained silent. Impact of Musk's words hanging in the air. After composing herself, Barrett spoke. With a markedly different tone than her initial challenge question, "Mr. Musk, thank you for that perspective. It contextualizes the human dimension of this case in a way our briefs perhaps did not fully capture." Chief Justice Roberts Recognizing the significant shift in the proceedings, intervened with unusual directness. Mr. Musk, the court cites it. Your personal testimony. Given what you've shared, I'd like to ask a more specific question about the FCC's technical justifications for these regulations. This opening allowed Musk to pivot back to the legal substance of the case, but with the emotional foundation now firmly established, he proceeded to methodically dismantle the FCC's arguments with newfound authority, explaining how the proposed regulations would disproportionately impact the most remote users while doing little to address the stated concerns about orbital congestion. The FCC's own technical analysis, which we've included Appendix C of our filing, demonstrates that the proposed satellite reduction would primarily affect coverage in precisely the rural areas. Justice Barrett referenced regions where population density doesn't support traditional telecommunications infrastructure. Justice Kagan seized on this point, so you're suggesting the FCC's approach is not merely misguided, but potentially discriminatory in its impact. That's correct, Justice Kagan. Musk replied, when regulations disproportionately harm the most vulnerable and isolated communities while granting exceptions for systems primarily serving urban areas, we have to question whether the public interest is truly being served. The FCC's attorney attempted to regain control of the narrative, rising to emphasize the technical rationale behind the regulations. Your Honors, while Mr. Musk's anecdotes are compelling, EY don't address the scientific consensus regarding orbital capacity and frequency allocation. This attempted pivot back to technical arguments fell flat, however, as Justice Barrett herself challenged the assertion. Counsel, is it the FCC's position that these human impacts are merely anecdotes rather than substantive considerations under the Communications Act's public interest standard? The FCC attorney visibly struggled with this unexpected challenge from a justice many had expected to be sympathetic to the tenant's position. No, Your Honor, but the Commission must balance multiple factors. In its regulatory approach, Justice Thomas, who had been silent until this point, spoke with characteristic directness. The question isn't whether balancing is required, but whether the FCC actually performed that balancing in a manner consistent with its statutory obligations. Mr. Musk has presented compelling evidence suggesting they did not. As the arguments concluded, transformation in the court's engagement was palpable. What had begun as a technical regulatory dispute had become a profound examination of digital equity and rural America's place in the modern economy. Legal observers in the courtroom recognized they had witnessed a pivotal moment not just for this case, but for how the court might approach technology regulation more broadly outside the courtroom. Musk offered only brief comments to the assembled press today. Wasn't about winning a legal argument. It was about ensuring the court understands what's truly at stake for millions of Americans who have until recently been left behind in our digital society. The image of Justice Barrett's emotional response quickly became symbolic of the day's proceedings, a rare moment when the technical abstraction of regulatory disputes gave way to authentic human connection, even in the formal chamber of the nation's highest court. The repercussions of the extraordinary Supreme Court hearings spread rapidly. Across legal, technological, and political spheres within hours, legal analysts on television and social media were describing the exchange between Justice Barrett and Elon Musk as a pivotal moment in technology regulation and the humanization of policy. Supreme Court observers noted the rarity of such emotional displays during oral arguments. Georgetown law professor Elena Richardson told CNN, "In my 20 years studying the court, I've never seen a justice who is visibly moved to tears during proceedings." That moment between Barrett and Musk transcended typical legal discourse and may prove influential when the justices confer on this case. The impact on public perception was immediate and significant. Polling conducted in the days following the hearing showed a dramatic shift in how Americans viewed both Starlink specifically and rural connectivity generally. A Gallup survey revealed that 78% of respondents now considered rural internet access a critical national priority, up from 52% prior to the Supreme Court arguments for rural communities. Hearing representation meant unprecedented visibility for connectivity challenges. The National Rural Telecommunications Cooperative reported receiving calls from dozens of congressional offices suddenly interested in broadband legislation that had languished. What happened in that courtroom made rural connectivity a kitchen table issue overnight, explained The organization's director's reaction crossed traditional partisan lines. Republican Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa praised Musk's advocacy for rural Americans, while Democratic Representative Cheri Bustos emphasized how the case highlighted the urgent need for a comprehensive approach to digital equity. Governors from predominantly rural states issued a joint statement, urging the court to recognize the human dimension of telecommunications policy. Within the telecommunications industry, the hearing prompted significant strategic reassessments. 3 major providers announced expanded rural investment initiatives within a week, clearly attempting to demonstrate their own commitment to underserved communities. Satellite industry executives privately acknowledged that Musk had successfully reframed the narrative from technical regulatory compliance to human impact. The FCC itself faced immediate scrutiny and congressional oversight. Committees announced hearings to examine whether the commission had adequately considered rural impacts in its regulatory approach. Former FCC commissioners from both parties published an open letter questioning whether the agency's technical focus had lost sight of its fundamental obligations for Justice Barrett. The hearing marked a subtle but noticeable evolution in her subsequent public statements about technology cases. Speaking at a judicial conference the following month, she emphasized the importance of recognizing the human consequences of technical regulatory decisions and acknowledged that judges must guard against abstractions that obscure real-world impacts, particularly on vulnerable communities. The most concrete impact came 3 months later, when the Supreme Court issued its ruling in a 7-2 decision authored by Justice Barrett herself. The court ruled that the FCC had failed to adequately consider the public interest implications of its proposal, particularly for rural and underserved communities. The opinion specifically cited the compelling evidence presented during oral arguments regarding the human dimension of connectivity access. The court didn't simply invalidate the FCC's. It established a new framework requiring explicit consideration of geographic equity and telecommunications regulation. Scholars describe the opinion as establishing digital inclusion as a fundamental consideration in administrative law and a landmark in how courts evaluate technology. Regulation for Elon Musk. The victory extended beyond the specific regulatory challenge. His companies had long faced criticism about their founder's perceived disconnection from ordinary Americans' concerns. The hearing humanized not just the rural connectivity issue but also Musk, revealing dimensions of his background and motivations previously unknown to the public. SpaceX leveraged this shift in perception to launch an expanded Connected Communities initiative, partnering with rural schools, healthcare providers, and agricultural organizations to develop specialized applications for previously underserved regions. When announcing the program, Musk explicitly referenced the Supreme Court case. This isn't just about providing internet access. It's about ensuring every American can fully participate in digital society, regardless of geography, is perhaps the most lasting impact came in how the case influenced the national conversation about technology's role in addressing geographic inequality. Major universities established research centers focused on rural connectivity. Solutions investment in rural-focused technology startups increased by 64% in the year following the decision policy. Discussions about technology increasingly incorporated explicit consideration of geographic equity alongside other dimensions of digital inclusion. 6 months after the hearing, Barrett and Elon Musk appeared together, though separately, at a rural telecommunications conference in Kansas City. While they didn't share the stage, Barrett's keynote address emphasized how the case had deepened the appreciation for human technology's impact, while Musk focused on the transformative potential of connectivity for communities long left behind, millions of rural Americans. The case represented a rare moment when their daily challenges commanded the attention of the nation's highest legal authorities. A farmer in rural Minnesota perhaps captured the significance most succinctly in a letter published in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. For once, the people who make the rules had to confront the reality of life without the digital connections they take for granted. Sometimes it takes tears in a courtroom to make people see what's been invisible. Thank you for watching our detailed analysis of this landmark Supreme Court case. If you found this examination valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of the complex intersection of technology, law, and society. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. How might this case change how we approach rural connectivity in America? We'll continue following developments as the impact of this remarkable courtroom moment continues to reshape technology policy nationwide.